everyone. Thanks for joining us. If you're listening today to the live webinar on May 9th, 2018, and want to earn ASHA CEUs for the course, be sure to attend the entire 1-hour session, complete the ASHA participant form and the evaluation form, and mail those to Darlene Davis, and her address, as you can see, is on this slide. You need to have the documents postmarked no later than 5/16/2018 so that she has time to process those forms and send them on to ASHA. Anything that we receive that's postmarked after that date will not be submitted. If there's more than one person at your location today listening to this webinar, be sure to download the attendance sheet. You don't need to do that if you're the only person on the line. No CEUs are offered for the recording of this session that will be available on the website after May 9th. So appreciate having you here, and I'm happy to introduce Dr. Kathleen Williams, who is presenting our program today.
So if you're in Eastern time, good afternoon, and if you're in any other time zone, I guess good morning is appropriate. How many of you, can you raise your hand if you are, that this is the first of the 3 sessions that you are attending, that you're not a repeat attender? 26 people I see. Okay. We've been doing this as a series of 3 for those of you that this is your first session. The first session was on little kids, preschool, and then we did the second one on children in grades 1 through 8. And now in this session, we're going to focus on high school age transitioning into college or workforce and or both. Certainly if you get a college degree, you want to be able to transition into the workforce. According to ASHA requirements, I need to give you a little bit of background about myself. Plus, I also like you to know who you're listening to. As you can see from the slide, I worked in the schools wearing many different hats. And then after I got my doctorate, I went and worked for test publishers, first for the Psychological Corporation, which is now owned by Pearson, and actually where I first met Nancy. And then for AGS, which is also now owned by Pearson. And then the third publisher I worked for was the College Board, where I was the Vice President of Test Development, having all the test development committees from SAT to AP to CLEP and so forth reporting up to me. So I know quite a lot about vocabulary needs of students transitioning to college and also transitioning to the workforce, and we will be talking about that, as I said, this afternoon. I'm now semi-retired. This is what I do, acting as a consultant not only for publishers but directly to school districts. And I am a nationally certified school psychologist. I have a life license in elementary education, and as you can see, there are several degrees. So let's move on. I have to do a disclosure for ASHA. The assessments and the materials listed at the top, I do receive a royalty. I am paid for authoring those assessments. And the assessments at the bottom I authored when I was at AGS. And at AGS at that time, it was an employee-owned company. So even though Pearson owns those assessments now, I do not receive a royalty on those assessments. So what do I hope that you get out of this session this afternoon? I hope that you gain some knowledge about the research that supports the value of a rich and broad knowledge of vocabulary throughout the development of such throughout a person's lifetime. I tend to spend a lot of time talking about interventions you can share, not only with teachers but also directly with high school students or with their parents, and procedures that you can help implement. As I said, not only working with parents and teachers but also directly with students, making them responsible for advancing their own vocabulary. This is a little bit of the overview that we're going to follow, the agenda we're going to follow this afternoon. I will try to leave time for wrap-up, but I do try to watch questions over there to the left and answer them as we go along, if I can, if time allows. If I don't answer your question, if somehow I miss it, I know Pearson does get those questions to me afterwards, and I'll try to respond to you. As we have started the other two sessions, I always took some time to make sure we were talking about the same thing, that we're defining what is vocabulary in the same way. So when I talk about vocabulary, I'm talking about your lexical store, what it is that you know both receptively and expressively, because to know a word is to know a concept, and you have a label for that concept. And maybe you use it when you're listening or reading. You use that knowledge to understand what you hear or read, or perhaps you use that knowledge to fluently speak or write. So we're not talking about how many words you can decode, although vocabulary, of course, is directly related to your ability to read and write, as all of your four language skills, listening, speaking, reading, writing, are interrelated. We will talk a lot about differences, and in the past we've talked about significant score differences, but I want to start today talking about differences that appear in all of us in our life cycle. And by that I mean the differences in when we talk about the depth of our vocabulary knowledge as opposed to when we talk about the breadth of our vocabulary knowledge. And what we see, and this is what I'm going to be talking about here, is based on several very important researchers in our field, the field of speech pathology. One in particular, Dr. Elizabeth Carroll Wofolk, talks about this extensively in her materials, the books she's written, and also in her sections of her test manuals. The fact that when we are little ones learning to talk, we develop a depth to our vocabulary. Think about it, if you are a parent or you yourself have worked with children under the age of 5, children tend to use the words they hear. So they try to really develop in depth the vocabulary they know. If they hear a word like dog, you can have that example where they call everything a dog, and so they're using it receptively and expressively to kind of try it out and make sure that they've got that definition of what is meant when they say dog is truly known. What we talk about when we talk about little kids, we're really talking about depth of vocabulary. They're developing a vocabulary that's deep, that they understand and they can use. Sometimes that works well, and sometimes if you have been a parent of a little one, for example, my husband used to say before we started having children, he said, I'm afraid that the first word our kids are going to say is S-H-I-T, because you have a tendency to use that word when you get disgusted or, burn your hand cooking. So, yeah, I mean, we've all seen that with little kids. They hear a word, they start using that word right away, whether we want them to or not. But they're developing that depth of vocabulary. Now, what happens as kids progress through school and start school and progress through the grades is they are developing a breadth of vocabulary because suddenly there's wider exposure to things that they see and hear and learn about. So we find that there's this diverse set of words, which is what we want. And then as we get older, we're back to having more a commonality of words using, we're back to this idea of depth. So I like to think of it in terms of, first there's depth, because we're getting a vocabulary that we understand and can use. Then there's breadth, because we're entered this period of school where there's so much coming at us, and we're picking up the nuances of a lot of words, we hope. And then we go back to depth and think about it for yourselves. As speech pathologists, we have a depth to our vocabulary that we use specifically for our career. And we're going to be talking today about, teenagers transitioning to college and to career. And it's important to note that this is a time to develop depth, to have a vocabulary unique to your work situation, to your profession, that you really need to know. Let me give you one example. We as speech pathologists, we use the word articulation. And we're at a cocktail party, or let's just say a neighborhood party. If you use that word articulation to your neighbor who's a mechanic or an engineer or any number of other fields, their depth of knowledge about the word articulation, specifically, let's say if they're an engineer, is probably very different than ours. So it's just this situation where we need to think about in terms of how our vocabulary grows and what's important at that stage in our life. And so it's depth, then breadth, then depth. And another way to understand this is to think about those of us who have studied the history of our mandatory free education in this country. That was one of the main purposes of acculturation. In other words, we wanted free and appropriate education so that we had a populace that had a breadth of knowledge so that they could be an informed electorate. That was the whole purpose. Now, let's hope we have an informed electorate, but that is what we hope to see, and one of the main reasons for having education is to get individuals to develop a breadth of knowledge. But as we move into choosing a career or a study, a field of study, then we have to support students, and like I said, often working directly with them to explain to them that they will need to develop depth to their vocabulary in order to speak fluently in whatever career field they've decided to follow. So that's sort of like the broad overview of how we look at vocabulary in the general population. Now, we've talked about this before, but when we give a vocabulary test, then we're comparing the general population and how does an individual compare to the general population. And when we see an individual doing better receptively than expressively on a test, now I'm talking about a test, sometimes, especially if that score is significantly higher than the expressive score, we can think about the student who has really broadened their vocabulary and can use, like I said, partial knowledge to fill in the blanks when doing a listening task, or like on the PPBT where it's a forced choice, 4 options, and they know partial knowledge. Strong knowledge of what we call the prevailing culture, broad background. When we see the opposite on a test, where there is this higher score on the expressive, we have several ways of looking at that, and definitely one of them is this lack of automaticity, being able to speak better than just listen, being more involved, because when we speak as opposed to when we listen, when we write as opposed to when we read, it involves more active processing. And many people do better when they can be active. We also have talked about how if your knowledge base is slightly different from others, maybe, let's say, from understanding that the general public, most people would call, when shown a certain picture, would call it a couch, but from your background, you call it a davano, which isn't a common word for it, where couch and sofa are probably the more common words. But again, when you find out that you have an individual who has labels for things in our culture, but they're slightly different labels, it's a great beginning for working on vocabulary, because teaching somebody another label for something is so much easier than trying to teach the concept in the first place. Because if you don't have a label for something, then that clearly shows you're not understanding, you have no comprehension of that concept. So vocabulary really represents the concepts we have and can label in our world. Now, when we talk about at this level, vocabulary, we really need to think about how that vocabulary has developed in children, let's say adolescents. And most of our research tells us that it develops through reading. You can't possibly teach anyone all the vocabulary they need to know. Stanivis said this the best. He called it the Matthew effect. The little ones, the vocabulary that they bring to school, that's the vocabulary that they use to learn to read. But it's by reading that we further develop our vocabulary. And the other thing that Stanivis says is that vocabulary continues throughout your reading development and remains in force for even us, fluent readers. Unfortunately, Barber and other researchers who have looked at high school students who are struggling with reading and found that they haven't advanced much beyond the 6th grade reading level, and therefore they are disadvantaged at developing vocabulary commensurate with their same age peers and general knowledge commensurate with their same age peers, which is so important as individuals leave an educational setting and let's say the public school setting and go on to college or the world of work. They're not going to teach them at McDonald's about that vocabulary on their pay stub and what it means to have money taken out of their paycheck before they get it. And if they don't have the general knowledge and the vocabulary to understand what those deductions are, then they're going to be at a loss. So, this is just part of the general knowledge that we gain by reading. So we have to have vocabulary to learn to read and comprehend, and we need to expand that vocabulary by continuing to read. And that's not reading text on our cell phone, unfortunately. So what we like, our premise is that the oral language skills or vocabulary and syntax knowledge that young children have, that helps them comprehend what they read. And what they read and comprehend further develops their oral language skills and their background and world knowledge. And well-developed oral language skills and wide background knowledge then helps students comprehend more difficult and complex literature and text that they will see in the content areas in high school and beyond, and in life. So we're going to talk, and we have talked about effective vocabulary instruction. We've talked a lot about phonological awareness in previous sessions. We're going to talk some about morphological awareness today. Definitely, I want to underscore again wide reading at home and in school, providing illustrations as much as possible in natural context